Hey Stampers, this is Jerry Mobley, and today I'm going to be demonstrating 5 distress techniques to provide texture and interest to your paper crafting. So this can be for cards or scrapbooking. What we're going to do first is something called crumpling, and it's very simple. It's just like wadding up a piece of paper to put in the trash. So let me show you with a clean piece of cardstock. Cardstock, because it is heavier weight, is a little bit tougher. You do have to work it a little bit longer than you would, like, say, a piece of copy paper. But the more you work at it and play with it, the better it's gonna look. And so you can decide how much of this you want. You can even do some little tearing on the side if you want to make it look even more used and old and distressed. So that is the first and very easy way to distress your paper. The second thing I want to show you is ripping and tearing. There's a couple of different ways that you can use ripping and tearing for your crafting. Now, you can buy rulers that are intended for this purpose that you lay across your paper and tear, and it creates a nice, very specific torn edge. But you really don't need that. You can even make one for yourself if you'd like to with a wood ruler. But I don't feel like it's something you really need. So this piece of paper demonstrates controlled tearing. And what that looks like is this. I want a straight line. So I am going to very carefully and gently tear this paper in a straight line. Now, obviously, you want some interest to that line. You don't want it to be perfectly straight, but it can be different depending on what your needs are, okay? So this is a controlled tear. Now, you noticed I was tearing towards myself, and that provides this really fun look on this side of the paper that I'm planning on using. The other side doesn't show as much of that tearing. So depending, again, on what you want to use, you have those two options. So that is controlled tearing. Now, there's also what I would call just straight ripping, which is taking a piece of paper and ripping it in two, like you see here, okay? And so what I did is I simply said, hey, I want an angle, so I'm just gonna rip this paper. And you notice that was much less controlled than the way I did before. But maybe I don't like the way it turned out. I can still play with that and tear it some more until I'm happy with the piece of paper and what I plan to do with it in my card or my scrapbooking. So that is tearing. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is edge scraping. This is something I really love to do because it just adds a little bit of texture. Well, you can add even more with it actually, but you see here I just added a little bit of texture to the side. And this is so neat because all you need is your paper snips, and you just scrape them along the side of the paper like this, and it creates a mess, but it also creates some great texture to your piece of paper. And you can do more if you want. You can try to notch it and rip it and do as much or as little as you need for whatever the project is. Just like all of these techniques, they can be varied. You can also use a simple butter knife. Now, I know people sometimes like to use steak knives because they're sharper, but you know, be careful with that too. Both your scissors and your steak knife you would need to be careful with. There is a special scraping tool out there in the crafting world that you can buy, but it's really not necessary. Using your snips is very, very easy, and it creates a great look. Clean up my mess here. The next thing we're going to talk about is rolling. Now, rolling is very simple. It's simply taking, like, say, the corner of your paper and rolling it up to make it look a little more vintage or used, or whatever your purpose might be. Now, you might notice in this card I've used other techniques too. I've used daubing. So let me show you how to use an ink dauber, because that's the next thing I want to talk about, and we'll come back to this. So here's my example. I used the Country Floral Dynamic folder, embossing folder, to make this piece of paper right here. and it's beautiful all on its own. But when you put it up against a white card, in this case I wanted to make an anniversary card, when you put it up against another piece of white cardstock, you kind of lose it. Yes, it has a different texture and that's great, but there are ways to make it pop. So I decided to do ink daubing on it, and this is what I created. It's very simple. You just take your ink pad and a dauber, and you go along the edges of your piece like this, and it creates that vintage fun look that really pops on a card. Now the other thing you can do with this is you can go across that raised area and create that kind of look if that's something you're going for, which is really fun because it makes the images in the paper pop as well. But it gives you that really rustic vintage look. Okay, so that is using an ink dauber to create that feeling in a card of the vintage worn out look. So here's a couple more examples. This one right here shows you how that rustic look can feel. Instead of more of a pretty vintage look, we can go more rustic with it. And I simply used soft suede on this one instead of petal pink, and that created that look. And what's really neat is you can do this same technique to your envelopes. Look at that. It looks like parchment. It makes a really wonderful look. Also, you can take your dauber, and instead of only doing the edges of a piece of paper, you can do the entire piece of paper. And with that soft suede, this actually looks like suede. It's fantastic. Now what's neat is that you can also use different techniques together. So don't be scared to come through with your dauber and change this up a little bit and add more ink to it to give you that vintage feel. Or come back and do edge scraping on this too. You can combine all of these techniques. Now the last thing that I wanted to talk about today, I can't actually show you here in this environment, but you can distress your papers with tea or coffee. And all you need to do is boil some tea or coffee, try to make it fairly strong, and then put your paper in the boiling water with tongs or something so you don't burn yourself. But put your paper in that water and let the paper absorb the color of the tea or coffee. Take it out, let it dry, and you have a really wonderful distressed look. So that's 5, well actually 6 different techniques that you can use to distress your papers and provide that interest and texture and just another fun element to your paper crafting. You guys have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.